This is a presentation that I'm doing in part because I've been teaching Bentham for a long time in intro classes and ethics classes and in modern philosophy classes. And he's an important figure, particularly in moral theory. And over again, we teach him as just a consequentialist. If we actually start looking at his text, you see there's a lot more to his ideas. And I'm going to lead you through some of those today. This mainly has to do with what we call philosophy of action. Since a lot of you are in Andrei Bukharev's class, a lot of you know this term philosophy of action because that's one of his specialties. It's also something that I'm interested in from a somewhat different, more historical perspective. So, when we think about Bentham, if you haven't encountered him yet, these are the sort of things that you're going to typically run into. These are the general understanding, the sort of footnotes or Cliff Notes version. He's the father of a movement in philosophy called Utilitarianism. That ends up orienting itself around what's called the greatest happiness principle. So if there's only one thing you remember from your ethics class about Bentham, hopefully that will be it. It's a consequentialist moral theory, meaning that it pays particular attention to what happens when we do actions. And it evaluates whether actions are good or bad based on whether they have good or bad effects, good or bad consequences, good or bad outcomes. There's a few other things that are kind of quirky about Bentham that I wanted to get out of the way right away. If you don't know about these, some of them may be a little bit shocking to you. There's what's called the auto icon, and there's a whole story behind that we can tell later on. And then he's also the theorist of an important idea in criminology called the panopticon. So, this is the auto icon. Jeremy Bentham's preserved corpse at University College London, preserved according to his will. Well, the only part that's not actually preserved of it is his head. That's a wax head. So if you're going to talk about Bentham, inevitably this comes up. I wanted to sort of get it out of the way right at the beginning. So, we can talk about that later if you want, but, I wanted to sort of clear the air of that. The other idea is the panopticon. And this is an interesting idea in penology or the theory of prisons. And the idea was you wanted to create a new kind of prison where people would be under surveillance all the time, or at least think that they're under surveillance all the time. You may hear sometimes references to the panopticon society in places where they have a lot of cameras, and you never know which camera is running or who's watching it. So Bentham is the originator of that, but those aren't the things that I'm going to talk about tonight. Those are interesting little features. He's the father of utilitarian philosophy. So what do we typically mean by this when we're looking at that? Well, like I said, it's a consequentialist theory. It's hedonistic, meaning that it focuses on pains and pleasures. It reduces all moral values ultimately to pains and pleasures. The greatest happiness principle is at the center of Bentham's moral theory, and if you want to boil it down, it says that moral evaluation should judge in terms of everybody's pleasures and pains. So you want to look at what is going to maximize human happiness, minimize human misery, and you can understand these in terms of pain and pleasure. He provides something that he called the Hedonic or Philippic calculus, a means by which to calculate this sort of thing. Those of you who are going to be business majors or do a few other types of things along those lines may run into this in terms of cost-benefit analyses. It's very similar to what Bentham is doing. Now, is this enough? This is enough for teaching him in ethics, or perhaps even in some other classes as well. None of it's wrong, but that's not all there is to Bentham. This is kind of a caricature, like I put here. What is a caricature? It has the broad outlines of something, but it's a little bit distorted. It doesn't give you the full picture. So how can we discover a fuller understanding of Bentham? I think there's three main ways or main approaches that we can take. One is by doing good textual work. I'm a historian of philosophy, so what that means is I read texts. If I want to know what Descartes thinks, I got to read what Descartes actually said. There's no way around that. I want to read everything that the guy wrote if possible so that I can get the whole picture. You know, if you wrote a letter to somebody about some issue that, you know, comes up in another text, I probably want to read that letter because there might be something there. A lot of what you're doing in that case is actually reading stuff that later on you're not going to use, because it turns out you don't actually need it. But good research done in that way, good textual work, means you actually have to take a look at the text and what are they saying. Good historical work. You also want to look at historical figures in terms of how they fit into the history of ideas. Not just the history of philosophy, but the history of culture and civilization in general. Bentham is an important figure in that. And then good comparative work. How does Bentham address the sort of issues or problems or controversies that other similar philosophers are looking at? You know, does he skip over things that we might want him to take a look at? So I put a diagram here. I think that these all reinforce each other, and this is what it is, or this is an understanding of what it is to do good history of philosophy. In this case, to understand Bentham. So I'm going to skim over some of this fairly quickly, because we're not actually going to do much with the history of ideas. We're doing more textually oriented work, looking at what is he actually saying. But I do want to sort of fill in the gaps for you, give you a kind of guidepost to where this guy sits. There are some traditions that utilitarianism is kind of bringing together. And you may have encountered some of these figures in other classes, maybe not necessarily philosophy, it could be a history class where they're mentioned, or a political science class. Thomas Hobbes, for example. How many of you have heard of Thomas Hobbes? There's quite a few. John Locke, about the same amount. David Hume? Less? Oh, that's surprising. How about Adam Smith? That's surprising, because usually we hear about Smith in terms of economics and the invisible hand and capitalism. All of them are actually doing something that will feed in to utilitarianism. Bentham actually references all of these people, except for Hobbes, it was a little bit dangerous at the time to identify with. Then there's some other figures that are not quite so well known. I'm actually going to skim over that because you guys we're going to make this sort of an introductory level thing, since that's where most of the students are. There's some other European Enlightenment thinkers that, are any of you planning on being criminal justice majors in here? Okay, a few. So you may actually encounter Beccaria, who is an important theorist in the understanding of punishment. Bentham is actually reacting to him and drawing on him. This other guy, Helvetius. Then Bentham gives rise to a whole movement. He coins this term utilitarianism. He was, in some ways, the right guy at the right time to bring together a lot of threads of thought in a very systematic way. And he gives rise to an entire movement that is still going on today. Somebody like Peter Singer would be an example of a contemporary utilitarian. Another important part of the history of ideas, utilitarianism is like one of the great boogeymen for all sorts of other theorists, who, for right or for wrong, sometimes they're on target with their complaints, sometimes they're off target. Poets in particular love to attack utilitarians because they are reducing everything to utility. Sometimes they're on track, sometimes they're not. Bentham was also a contributor to legal reforms. One of the main motivating drives for his work was changing the British legal system, which at the time that he was engaging it was, fairly irrational and corrupt. He actually spent a lot of his ink writing about that. Now, usually if we're going to teach Bentham, we teach the introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. And we usually only teach several chapters from it. But it's actually a much larger work. And he did intend it to be an introduction to principles. That's, the general ideas behind morals. What's morals? Ethics. He understands it, more or less synonymously. And legislation. So this is also political philosophy and philosophy of punishment. He also wrote another book much later on that doesn't get read very often, but is important to look at if you actually want to do work on Bentham, called Deontology. It's a little bit misleading to call it that, because normally we think of deontology, we think of Kant or other moral theorists who are focusing primarily on duties and are not, utilitarians. But he actually used the word for this text that he wrote. It was published posthumously. He's got a table of the spring of actions. You might say, well, why are we looking at a table? Well, you'll see the table in a moment. You'll see how detailed it is. And it's worth actually looking at, especially with its explanations. He wrote a piece about the promulgation of laws that had some interesting things to say. He had another work called The Instruments of Invention and Discovery. And then Bentham was big on making up words, so he's got nomography, which is basically about laws as well. Nomos is law, graphy is writing. And all of these are important to look at if we want to understand his philosophy of action. This you can't see very well. You can get some sense of just how detailed this is. This is Bentham's table of the springs of action. Bentham was nothing if not systematic. This is a guy who, when you read him, he's going to be really boring to read, admittedly. Rewarding if you put in the time, but very boring, because Bentham loves to make all sorts of enumerations. You guys have all encountered that, you know, and you have to kind of force yourself to read it, but when you do, it actually is kind of, you know, it pays off in being interesting. These are all the different kinds of pleasures and pains that cause our actions to be the way that they are, to get us to do the things that we do. Bentham tried to come up with an exhaustive enumeration of them. So now we get to Bentham and the philosophy of action. We've talked about, very briefly, the history of ideas. We've talked about which texts we're going to look at. I showed you one of, you know, the texts. We want to talk about philosophy of action now. So when we're talking about Bentham's philosophy of action, we can't actually separate it completely from his moral philosophy, what we call philosophical anthropology or theory of human nature, and his political philosophy. And what I'm asking here is, if we combine these perspectives, what sort of interests and issues are we bringing to our study of Bentham's text? And oftentimes, these are the things that we come to the table with if we're going to read Bentham. We're interested in moral evaluation of actions, consequences, whatever else. That would be in an ethics class, typically, right? Or maybe we're interested in critique of current institutions, society, you know, that sort of thing. Maybe we're in a political philosophy class in that case. Or maybe we're doing ethics and we have a more socially oriented way of doing it. Another possible response, maybe we're looking at what motivates human beings in order to change society along utilitarian lines. The people who are actually part of the utilitarian movement today, you know, that's their project. What else do we want to understand? If we're talking about philosophy of action, and I'm glad that we have so many students that are getting some introduction to the philosophy of action, you know, in these intro classes. These are the sorts of topics that we're really interested in. You know, first of all, whether human action is free or determined. That's a big question. When you make a choice, are you actually choosing freely, or did something causally, somewhere in the background, make you make that choice? That's a big question. Or could it be both? There's a position that we call compatibilism, which is probably the more interesting one, you know, because if you say it's both, you've got a lot of explaining to do, don't you? What are the most fundamental motivations for human actions? This is, you know, one of those questions that's never going to go away. We're always going to be asking about that. What makes people do what they do? What are the distinct human motivations or desires? What's the full range of these? Are some of them normal and some of them abnormal? You know, do we all have the same basic desires, or do they vary? We want to know what the roles of the human will and the intellect are in producing action or guiding action. We want to know how people actually reason things out, if they do. Maybe they don't actually reason things out. Maybe they just sort of do things. Or maybe it's, you know, a sort of less conscious process of reasoning which we could reconstruct. But, you know, we want to know that sort of thing. What role does what we call affectivity? And affectivity includes all those things that you feel, you desire, your urges, your moods, all those sorts of things are affectivity. We want to know whether habitual dispositions actually exist or not, and what role they play. Do they get us to do things? Do they not? How do you produce them? How do you get rid of them? And then, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is what we call acrosia, or weakness of will. When you know what the right thing to do is, and you find yourself nevertheless doing something else. And while you're doing it, you're like, boy, I shouldn't be doing this. That's what we call acrosia. Something went wrong somewhere, and we want to be able to figure out, whether that actually is a good description of what's going on, and what causes it. Now, Bentham's own work, if you want to know something about the person that you're reading, if they've actually said something about their own work, that's the best place to go. Presumably, they know their own writing better than anybody else, right? Bentham gave an evaluation of his own work in the foreword to the introduction, so major work. And he's talking about what's good about his work and what's bad about it. And he was, a fairly self-critical guy. He said that he thought that the chapters that deal with actions, intentionality, consciousness, motivations, dispositions, and consequences were among the best chapters that he wrote in that work. Some of those are chapters that actually get paid attention to. Some of them are less often frequented by people reading Bentham's text. So if you really want to see what Bentham is up to, you probably want to look at those. So, what was he interested in? One of the things that keeps coming up over and over again, Bentham was not just interested in putting forth a moral theory or changing the legal system. He wanted to develop what he called the logic of the will. So he wanted to find out, not just what makes us do the things that we do, but how do you actually systematically put these things together? How do you structure this sort of thing? He says, there is, or rather there ought to be, a logic of the will as well as of the understanding. The operations of the former faculty are neither less susceptible nor less worthy than those of the latter, of being delineated by rules. The typical Bentham there. I'm going to skip over the nomography one. He talks about promulgation of laws. He says, if the laws were actually founded on reason, they would infuse themselves, so to speak, into the minds of the people. They would form part of the, and again he uses this term, logic of the people. They would extend their influence over their moral nature. So he's interested in how do we understand the will systematically. Now there's some problems. Bentham likes to use the word will and never defines it, never actually analyzes it. So, if we're going to approach this, and this is particularly important for students who are approaching it for the first time, what do philosophers typically mean when they talk about the will? These are some of the main things. A faculty of choice, able to choose between alternatives to decide between goods. Something different from just mere affectivity, something that can actually, say, I've got desires for this, but I'm going to hold off from it. It can interface and listen to reason. A reflexive faculty. Very often when you have a theory of the will can not only determine, say, whether my hands are going to do this, or whether I'm going to walk over here or walk over here. The will can actually determine itself. And so it's reflexive. And we also look at it as often being the locus of moral character, or moral education, or the moral dispositions, depending on how complex of a notion of the will you have. What does Bentham say about the will? He likes to use the word. He doesn't like the words voluntary and involuntary. He thinks they're too ambiguous, so he sort of strikes them from his character. And he also says some things that are a little puzzling. In the observations on the table, he says, employ the term free will to the exclusion of the term free will, employ the term necessity. The language so employed will not be found to be expressive of any real difference. So what does that tell us? That tells us, over here we've got what we call libertarianism. There actually is a free will. You make free decisions, at least some of the time. Over here we've got, the hardest of hard determinism. Everything is totally determined causally, determined ahead of time by things that you can't possibly change, but you could predict. Somewhere in the middle is compatibilism. Bentham must be some sort of compatibilist, because he's saying this and this, they're basically the same thing. It's one of the strangest passages in Bentham's works. He also says an act of the mind, so everything that you're doing when you're thinking is either an act of the intellectual faculty or of the will. Acts of the intellectual faculty will sometimes rest in the understanding merely without exerting any influence in the production of any acts of the will. There are some things that you think, and then there's things that you decide to do that motivate you. And he's interested particularly in those. He uses the term in multiple senses. Sometimes he means intention, because he actually identifies it. He says will or intention, and he's using them synonymously. At other times, he seems to talk about the will as this general faculty that produces human action. The will is the locus where these different forces are competing against each other, and eventually something comes out of it. The will is also determined through whatever information and inferences that the intellect is able to supply to it. So we want to ask, how does the will actually work for Bentham? How is it determined? He tells us the will necessarily yields to the solicitation of the greatest good. So this sounds fairly familiar in the sort of the history of ideas. The will yields to the solicitation of the greatest apparent good. Whatever it is that if we have good over here and good over here, if this seems to be a better good, my will turns that way. How should we understand this? One way we could understand this is a very intellectualist view, where practical reason, working with the information it possesses, tells the will, hey, go after that good, because that's the better good. Maybe it could be wrong. Maybe reason didn't get all the information, and it thinks that this good over here is better than it is. But the basic working would be, reason figures out which of these goods is the best one, tells the will, go after it. The will says, all right, I'll do that, and then the will gets things going. What gets everything moving? Well, what gets everything moving in the first place, though, is desire or affectivity. So how do we understand this? Bentham has a very clear answer to this. Pleasure and pain. This is one of the things that's particularly attractive about Bentham's theory. And when I say attractive, I don't mean attractive to me. I'm not a utilitarian. I'm just somebody who likes reading Bentham and talking about him. I actually think he's wrong in a lot of points. But I like the fact that his theory is very clear, very coherent, that you can tell where he's going with things. He tells us this at the very beginning of the text that you are probably going to read if you read any Bentham. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as determine what we shall do. So there's 2 points being made there. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, so moral philosophy. On the other hand, the chain of causes and effects, human motivation, are fastened to their throat. That's his stunning piece of rhetoric that he begins the introduction with. He goes on to say, they govern us in all that we do and all we say, all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off their subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. Speaking in terms that, again, if we want to bring in a little history of ideas, this almost sounds like the way that people back in the Middle Ages used to talk about divine providence. It's almost exactly the same kind of language. Now, how does this work when we start getting down to the nuts and bolts? It's all very fine to say, yeah, pain and pleasure make us do everything. Pains and pleasures in certain ways. So Bentham, the first thing that he really starts talking about are sanctions. And when you hear that term sanction, you probably think about getting in trouble, right? And he does have something like that in mind. Although it could be punishment or it could be reward. And he talks about 4 sanctions in the introduction. Again, the work you're most likely to encounter. Later on, he refines his theory so it includes 5. And the sanctions that he talks about are ways, pains, and pleasure as final causes, as things drawing us, become what he calls efficient causes, the things that make us do what we do. And these sanctions, he comes up with 4 of them originally, 5 later on. There's the physical. Physical sanctions are, if you, here's an example. This is not super hot coffee, but imagine it was, right? If I drink it, what happens? Do I feel pleasure? What do I feel? pain. And what kind? Like burning sensation, right? So I learned pretty quickly, hey, don't drink super hot coffee. That's gonna hurt next time. And the next time around, maybe I blow on my coffee, right? It modifies my behavior. You give me coffee, and I take a sip. You know, I haven't had, say it's some kind that I haven't had before. And you say, Dr. Sadler, try this out. I say, well, okay. That's good. I think I'll drink some more of this. Again, modified my behavior, right? These are what we call the physical sanctions. They cover a lot of things, and it has to do with, you know, learning from pleasures and pains that have nothing to do with anybody else's wills. Now, you can say, well, but I got you that coffee. Yeah, okay. But once I've actually got the coffee in my hand, it's just me and the coffee, right? Or if I decide to jump down the stairs rather than walk down the stairs, and I trip and, you know, get smashed up, I've learned a valuable lesson, right? Don't jump down the stairs. Now, if you push me down the stairs, that's a whole different matter. That wouldn't be the physical sanction. That might be something else. He then talks about the moral sanction. The moral sanction is what we call public opinion. And ethics falls into this for Bentham. What about, you know, what people are going to think of us if we do certain things? How do people react to us? You know, does their exhibitions of pain and pleasure modify our pains and pleasure? I mean, think about how you learn not to be a jerk, right? Every one of us has done some things that were kind of jerky at one time or another, and somebody else came along and said, knock it off. Don't do that. I don't like you when you do that. And then we learn, okay, quit being a jerk, right? This is very straightforward, very simple stuff. We also learned, hey, if I act this way, I'll get rewards that I like. Then there's the political sanction. This means, you know, the laws, the actual political structure. And some people you can't reach with the moral sanction, so you got to sanction them by, say, punishing them, you know, with various things. Bentham was big on talking about, you know, imprisonment, and we have other ways of doing that. There's the religious sanction, which he thinks is particularly inefficacious. The religious sanction means appeal to what God is going to do to you. You know, either God's going to like you or God's not going to like you. And Bentham kind of pushes that aside because, in part, you know, for one thing, Bentham doesn't actually believe in any of that stuff. But he had to sort of, you know, give lip service to it. But also in part because he thinks that, you know, those pleasures and pains are so far off that we don't really worry too much about them. And then he's got this thing that later on he introduces called the social or sympathetic sanction. And this means the people that are closest to you, your family and your friends. You care more about what they think, don't you, than about what other people think? Things work a little bit differently with them. You've chosen to, at least, you know, friends, family even when you get, you know, older, you've chosen to be with them and to care about what it is that they think. So you can see how these all fit in together. I created a kind of diagram here that gives you some idea about it. How do these actually work? He says they're efficient causes. They determine the ways in which pleasures and pains are produced. They help to determine your will, what he calls prospectively. So they make you think about what consequences are going to follow from your actions, and that may, you know, keep you from doing certain actions or incline you to doing certain actions. They also, like he says, determine a person's will retrospectively. You screw something up, you suffer, and then you say, wow, that was a bad idea for me to do that. Not only do you feel, you know, sort of, I better not do that next time, you look back on it and you say, that was a bad action for me to do. Ideally, he says, these sanctions should promote what he calls the principle of utility. Now, is this all there is to Bentham's views? This is already quite a bit, isn't it? There's a lot to take in. You know, if you're starting to get a headache or something like that, I can be kind of sympathetic with that, because that is a lot. There's yet more, though. Does this actually accord with Bentham's text? If it did, his texts ought to be a lot shorter than they are. We know they're not. He goes into these lengthy analyses of all sorts of things like motive, disposition, passion, virtue, and vice. So maybe one possible answer to this is to say all these moral concepts are just ways of thinking about pleasure and pain. That's one way to approach that. And there is some truth to that, and we'll see why. He says that really you should evaluate things on the basis of consequences, ultimately. But is that all that's going on? What does he actually say? This is why it's important to go to the text. He says, the effects of an intention to do such and such an act are the same objects which you've been speaking of under the appellation of its consequences, so there's that. And the causes of intention are called motives. So motives have a role there. It says a man's intention on any occasion may be styled good or bad, either to the consequences of the act or with reference to his motives. So again, motives assume some sort of moral role. If it be deemed good or bad in any sense, it must be either because it is deemed to be productive of good or bad consequences, or because it's deemed to originate from a good or bad motive. So really we have two different ways of evaluating intentions, and as we'll see, other things as well. What are the consequences? Do they have good or bad outcomes? And what is motivating the person? What's getting the person to do what they're doing? Now, ultimately, consequences are still the most important. But what I wanted to do this presentation for was to call attention to the fact that that's not all there is. Motives still play some sort of role. True, a role that feeds back into consequences, but it's a role that gets us to do the sort of things that we do, and Bentham is very interested in this. I'm going to skip through that. So if we look at Bentham's key ideas, right? We have consequences, those result from actions. What gets us to do our actions? We have intentions, and the intention can be either just to do the action sometimes, and we don't actually think about what we're doing, and then sometimes it turns out good, sometimes bad. Or sometimes we do the action just because we want the consequence. You know, show up to class at 8 o'clock in the morning. Are you showing up to class at 8 o'clock in the morning because you really love getting out of bed and going to class at 8 in the morning? I don't think so. You want to be present for the class because it fits into some sort of structure of motivation that you have, and you want certain consequences, namely getting a good grade, right? Intentions and dispositions and motives, they're arranged in a kind of set of connections with each other. Intentions are caused or determined by motives, so motives are more fundamental. Intentions and dispositions, he says, are the sum of a person's intentions, so really dispositions are kind of a reflection of that. And what about dispositions or motives? A disposition is evaluated based on the nature of the motives that a person is apt to be influenced by. So again, motives are much more important. If we look at these key concepts again, now it's starting to look a little bit more like your life, right? You not only have intentions, actions, and consequences, you have dispositions. Somebody can ask, what is this guy likely to do? What is this woman inclined to do in these sorts of situations? Those are dispositions. And how can you tell what somebody is like? Well, you're going to watch them for a while, right? And you don't just pay attention to the actions. If you can figure out what their intention is, sum those up, and now you know their disposition, Bentham would say. But what drives all of this is motives. And motives are, like he says, a general kind of desire for something. So he tells us, on every occasion, conduct is at the absolute command of, and is the never-failing result of, the motives. That means they're pretty important. By a motive, he says, is to be understood anything whatsoever which, influencing the will of a sensitive being, is supposed to serve as a means of determining him to act or voluntarily to forbear to act. So it's anything that can get us to go in a certain direction, and we'll see what he means by that in a moment. I'm going to skip over the other quote. When we're evaluating motives, he wants to evaluate them in terms of pleasure and pain. He's a critic of our current use of language, so we might say that somebody is motivated, for example, by lust, right? That's a motive that somebody has to do something. But what is lust? Lust is sexual desire, right? Is sexual desire in and of itself a bad thing, a good thing, maybe something neutral? Depends on the consequences for Bentham. What kind of activity, what kinds of action is it going to ultimately produce? So he is going to categorize 9 basic kinds of motives. And this is the list. Benevolence, that's the best motive for him. That means to do good to other people, to want to do good to other people. It's When you are happy that somebody else is happy, then you're benevolent. You obtain pleasure by giving somebody else pleasure. Desire for reputation, all of you understand that. People like you, you feel good. People don't like you, you feel bad. That can get you to do things. Desire for amity, very similar. Reputation has to do with a sort of public persona. Amity has to do with when people actually do really like you, or at least you feel like they really like you. We all have a natural tendency, Bentham thinks, to want people to like us. And that can get us to do a lot of things, good or bad. Physical desire, what does this mean? Everything from, wanting to have a sip of coffee because I don't actually need to, wet my throat. I'm not thirsty, but it tastes pretty good. And I like things that taste pretty good, so I want to have it. All the way to wanting to lay in the sun, or wanting to get out of the sun when you're starting to burn, sexual desire. All these things are comprised in physical desire. Self-preservation, that's a motive you need to have. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of trouble, right? Desire for power, desire for wealth, those are motives. Malevolence, what is malevolence? It's the opposite of benevolence. It's when you're going to take pleasure in somebody else's being harmed or hurt. And think about anger, for example. Bentham really doesn't like anger. In the Deontology, his classification of the passions pays almost exclusive attention to anger, and he says it's never good. Why? Because when you're angry, what do you want to do to the other person? Make them feel good? What do you want to do? Come on, all of you get angry, right? Some of you probably get angry today. What do you want to do to another person? What do you want them to feel when you're angry? What's going to make you feel better? When they feel pain, right? And malevolence, anger is just one form of malevolence. Malevolence is taking pleasure in somebody else's pain, or also feeling pained by somebody else's pleasure. Finally, there's motives of religion. Bentham says these are all over the map. I'm not even going to speculate about them. So he doesn't really worry about it. Instead of using terms like good or bad right off the bat, he thinks we need to think about these differently. Now remember, Bentham is a utilitarian, so that means that he thinks everybody's pleasures and pains are important. We want to take everybody into consideration. There are what he calls social motives. These are the things that tend to get us to behave in good ways in society, ways that tend to promote other people's happiness. Benevolence is all about other people's happiness, right? So that's going to do that more or less guaranteed. He worries a little bit about what he calls restricted benevolence, where you're only interested in your class, your group, your restricted society, and not about people in general. But in general, benevolence is the best. Desire for reputation, desire for amity, provided your society isn't totally screwed up. Desire for reputation is probably going to be leading you to good ends. Desire for amity, you're probably going to behave in fairly decent ways if you want people to like you. Again, unless you surround yourself with people who are totally screwed up. Dissocial motives. Well, malevolence, right? If you want to hurt people, if that's your main desire, you're probably not going to be very good company, are you? And then there's what he calls self-regarding motives. And you got to watch these a bit, because they can lead us to favor our own pleasures and to avoiding our own pains at the exclusion of other people. But he understands that these are legitimate. Dispositions and motives. This is the last thing we want to get to. Talk about how do we fit dispositions into this. So a disposition, he says, is a kind of fictitious entity. He doesn't think that dispositions really exist. They're a kind of being of reason, as they would call it back in the scholastic days. An entity that we create so we can give a name to something. They express what they're supposed to be permanent in a man's frame of mind, where they've been influenced by such and such a motive. Later on, he just uses the word habit as well as virtue and vice instead of disposition. Now, what makes a disposition good or bad? It's the motives. he says. So he talks about, and again, he uses this very fancy language, tutelary or seducing motives, right? Tutelary or preserving motives, these prompt a person to engage in action that's generally good. So, for example, benevolence. Benevolence is a tutelary. It teaches you, right? Teaches you to do the right thing. It preserves the good disposition. Seducing or corrupting motives. They prompt a person to engage in an action that's generally bad. Think about self-preservation if you add one other thing to the mix, like say you're a paranoid, right? What does it mean to be paranoid? Offhand, anybody? Easy definition of it? What's wrong with the paranoid's perception of the world? Everything looks too nice to them? What's wrong with them? Yeah.
Everything's dangerous.
Yeah, they perceive everything as being threatening, as hostile. And so if you have a natural instinct for self-preservation, which by itself is not bad, but you add to the mix that you're a paranoid, now you're going to think everybody's out to get you and that you better get them before they get you. And then suddenly, in those sort of circumstances, self-preservation can become a corrupting motive. Now, like he says, a good disposition is going to depend on susceptibility to tutelary motives. It doesn't mean that you're motivated by them all the time. It just means that you tend to be more influenced by them than bad motives. Think about when you get angry, for example. You get angry, do you nurse your anger and say, I'm going to get that person. I'm going to make them suffer. Sometimes people say, not only, I'm going to teach them never to cross me. So, somebody did something minor to them, and now you're going to do something really major to them so that you can make a spectacle of them, and nobody will ever mess with you again. That's going to be a pretty, seducing motive right there, right? Now, we may feel temptations about that sort of thing, but do we give in to them? Or do other motives influence us instead? Do we have the good angel on one shoulder and the bad angel on the other shoulder? The good angel actually saying, no, benevolence. Or even self-preservation. Don't go and attack that guy. You don't know what he's carrying. That might actually be a preserving motive in this case. So dispositions are how we're affected by this. Virtue and vice. Bentham does not use these terms very much in his early works, in part because at first he thinks that they're misleading. Later on, he actually tries to redefine virtue and vice. He says, not going to be able to get rid of this language, I better take it on. And he says that only insofar as it produces happy or misery can an act properly be called virtuous or vicious. Virtue and vice are but useless qualities unless estimated by their influences on the creation of pleasure and pain. Again, he calls them fictitious entities, as any disposition would be, spoken of as real for the purposes of discourse, and without fictions of this character on subjects such as these, discussions could hardly be carried on. He thinks that without these, we can't actually make sense of things. And he tries to reduce the virtues down to 2 virtues, which is kind of an interesting move. Says, what are the really valuable virtues? All the other ones come out of that. So he says prudence, which is looking out for yourself, taking care of yourself. It's self-oriented. And then beneficence. Beneficence goes beyond benevolence. Benevolence is just wanting to do good for other people, wanting other people to be happy. Beneficence is actually doing it. Actually engaging in behavior that's going to make other people happy. He says, beyond these, there's no intrinsically valuable virtue. Every other virtue traces back to one of these. So we've covered a lot of stuff. Hopefully you've seen that motives play an important role in Bentham's moral theory and his theory of action. They're not just something to sort of skim over if we can help it. You can see, I hope, how some of the other parts fit in with each other. And now we get to the Q&A part of it. And again, remember, I'm not a utilitarian myself. I just sort of play one at the podium. So. you've got a question, because I saw you shaking your head earlier. I mean, it'd be good to hear what a philosopher of action makes of this Bentham mess, you know?
What would I make?
Yeah, I mean, do you find this plausible, or?
Well, I think that his views are being quite similar to those of Hume.
Yeah.
Him, and he stands within the sort of the tradition of complicated action.
Yeah.
So it seems like, I mean, I wouldn't take issue with any sense of the way we should interpret it.
I'm sort of unconvinced by Bentham's own stuff. I find it really
I'm not
interesting.
necessarily convinced by Bentham.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I think the way that you're interpreting this.
Any other questions, comments, things that it provoked? It must be perfectly clear then.